Hi, my name is Taylor Hanel, and I'm a senior this year from Hillsdale, Michigan, and I'm majoring in biochemistry. It is my pleasure today to get the chance to introduce Mary Eberstadt. Mary Eberstadt is a senior research fellow at the Faith and Reason Institute. A graduate of Cornell University, Mrs. Eberstadt was a special assistant to Ambassador Jeane Kirkpatrick at the United Nations and speechwriter to the Secretary of State, George Shultz, during the Reagan administration. She has written for numerous publications, including Time, The Wall Street Journal, The Washington Post, National Review, First Things, and The Weekly Standard. She is the author of numerous books, including It's Dangerous to Believe Religious Freedom and Its Enemies, How the West Really Lost God, A New Theory of Secularization, and Adam and Eve After the Pill, Paradoxes of the Sexual Revolution. Please join me in a warm welcome for Mrs. Eberstadt.
Thank you. Good afternoon, and thank you for that warm welcome. It's a privilege to be here for the first time at Hillsdale, a college I've admired and hoped to visit for years now. Sincerest thanks to the conference organizers for inviting me and for this unique opportunity to reflect on one of the most critical developments, not only in recent times, but in human history itself, the sexual revolution. A few words about my enduring interest in the subject. Like everyone else here, I have diverse curiosities and leanings. I've been fortunate to write in many venues about many different things. But more and more, I have found that when trying to understand the post-1960s contemporary world, tracing matters to their roots inevitably involves circling back to the sexual revolution, including in some ways that we will count here today. Academics vary in their definitions, but here's a straightforward, uncontroversial formula. The revolution refers to the changes in sexual behavior and mores following the widespread adoption and approval of reliable contraception over half a century ago. The first accelerant here is the birth control pill, widely dispersed in the population after 1963. And the second accelerant is the legalization of abortion on demand in 1973 via Roe versus Wade. Modern contraception and legalized abortion not only changed behavior, they also changed attitudes. Around the world, social tolerance of non-marital sex in all its forms has risen alongside these other changes for logical reasons that I've talked about elsewhere, including in Adam and Eve After the Pill. Now, with the possible exception of the internet, it's impossible to think of any other single phenomenon since the 1960s that has reshaped humanity around the world as profoundly as this revolution. Some of the revolution's record is well known. 4 years ago, on the 50th anniversary of the approval of the birth control pill, there was an outpouring of commentary and reflection, most of it positive. The revolution, it was claimed and acclaimed in Time magazine and other secular venues, had leveled the playing field in the economic marketplace between men and women as it had never been leveled before. It had also conferred freedom on women such that they had never known before. Both those propositions are true as far as they go, but there's another side of the ledger that's been mostly ignored by a mainstream society saturated with the revolution's pleasures. With every passing year, more evidence accumulates that will someday change that predominant happy storyline. Today, I'd like to discuss 5 ways in which the revolution has reconfigured reality as we know it, including reality as taken straight from your news feeds and Twitter headlines. So let's look in some detail at 5 seeming paradoxes that point to the revolution's power, and in particular, to its awe-inspiring destructive power. I'd like to start with a little story that captures the scale of that change in a snapshot. I grew up in a series of small towns scattered across beautiful and forbidding upstate New York. North of the Hudson River Valley, a planet away from New York City, in an area known as the Leatherstocking region, where author James Fenimore Cooper set his famous tales. This was and still is rural blue-collar country. It was the kind of place where more local boys in the 60s went to Vietnam than went to colleges and universities. In many ways, a lot about this place is still the same as it was when I was a child, with one massive exception, which we'll call the family thing. In the 1960s, most men in this area worked as manual laborers, mainly in local copper and silver mills. Many women, if they married, stayed home. Most families, no matter how chaotic, were still intact, religious and non-religious alike. One of my strongest memories from those years is an odd but significant one. In 1972, just months before the legalization of abortion, a teenage girl in town became pregnant. The baby's father was a young soldier, newly returned from Vietnam. The town gossips were up in arms because, as it turned out, he didn't plan to marry her. In those days, that was considered shocking. Although pregnant brides were not exactly unknown, and pregnant teenage brides for that matter, men who didn't marry their pregnant girlfriends were objects of opprobrium. Eventually, the girl had the baby somewhere else where adoption followed. She came back and finished high school, to my knowledge, without stigma. But the stigma that does remain memorable was the other one, the one about her boyfriend. The idea that he should have taken responsibility, which the majority of adults in that era certainly seemed to believe, is an idea that's now gone, vanished with the revolution. Now, fast forward some 20 years. In the early 1990s, I went back for a visit to the same town, and I saw a former teacher. She told me that in the high school that year, in a class of 200 graduating seniors, 1/3 of the girls were pregnant. Not one was married. And of course, we can safely assume there were other pregnancies besides the visible ones, because various girls were also rumored to have gotten abortions. This, too, wasn't the shock in 1992 that it was in 1972, because after all, Roe versus Wade had been the law of the land for 2 decades. So here's the take-home from my story. From one scandalous pregnancy in a rural high school in the 1970s to many non-scandalous pregnancies in the same school by the 1990s, that's one snapshot showing how the sexual revolution has changed the world. It also leads us to the first of several paradoxes about the revolution. Let's call this paradox 1. If the whole point of the revolution was the availability of cheap, reliable birth control, then why did the following decades see an unprecedented rise in both abortions and pregnancies outside of marriage? This is a profoundly important question. It's an intellectual puzzle so puzzling that it's come to engage attention in serious places. After all, back when contraception became commonplace, many people of goodwill defended it precisely for the reason that they thought it would render abortion obsolete. Margaret Sanger is one prominent, if surprising, example. She called abortion barbaric, and she argued that contraception would put it out of business. Of course, there's reason to wonder how transparent she was, given that Planned Parenthood has gone on to claim her as its patron saint. But even so, Sanger was making a point that might seem to make common sense. A great many people, both before and after the 60s, have believed something similar. But the empirical record since the 1960s shows their logic to be wrong. That's exactly why research papers and arguments have emanated from the world of social science during the past decades, trying to explain the puzzling fact that far from preventing abortion and unplanned pregnancy, contraception's effects on society were more convoluted. contraception, abortion, and out-of-wedlock births all exploded simultaneously. So consider this attempt to solve the puzzle from over 20 years ago by economists George Akerlof, Janet Yellen, and Michael Katz, writing in the Quarterly Journal of Economics. They spelled out the dynamics of these simultaneous explosions with admirable clarity. In a summary of their argument, they said, before the sexual revolution, women had less freedom, but men were expected to assume responsibility for their welfare. Today, women are more free to choose, but men have afforded themselves the comparable option. If she's not willing to have an abortion or use contraception, the man can reason, why should I sacrifice myself to get married? By making the birth of the child the physical choice of the mother, the revolution has made marriage and child support a social choice of the father, unquote. So, in other words, they say, reason one why contraception led to more pregnancy and abortion was that it eroded the so-called shotgun wedding, or the idea that men had equal responsibility. Post-contraception, as the example of the story goes to show, the reasoning became that pregnancy was the woman's responsibility, and that if birth control failed, that was not the man's problem. There is also the secondary fact that contraception and abortion are bound together juridically, that is to say, as a matter of law. As Michael McCulloch, professor at Catholic University of America, recently pointed out, quote, as regards jurisprudence, the fruit of contraception is abortion. By 1973, only 8 years after Griswold, the Supreme Court in Roe v. Wade had inferred from the right to contraception, a right to abortion, unquote. Or to put the point more colloquially, in the matter of legal reasoning, no contraception on demand, no abortion on demand. Another interesting theory about why contraception failed to prevent abortion comes from researcher Scott Lloyd, writing in the National Catholic Bioethics Quarterly in 2015. Using studies and statistics from the abortion industry itself, he argues, like others, that one leads to the other. He summarizes, quote, the bottom line is contraceptives do not work as advertised, and their failure is at the heart of the demand for abortion. Contraception enables sexual encounters and relationships that would not have happened without it. In other words, when couples use contraception, they agree to sex when pregnancy would be a problem. This leads to a desire for abortion, unquote. So there are several other efforts within social science to explain this same paradox, but the larger point stands. Contrary to what people back in the 60s believed would happen, abortion and unplanned pregnancies have both flourished despite contraception. Now, many people present at the creation of the revolution couldn't possibly have anticipated that paradoxical consequence. Many people operating in good faith hoped that humanity would master these new technologies and that they'd prove to be a social good. But those of us alive today are in possession of a wealth of empirical evidence that's been piling up for decades now. And we can see through perfectly secular social science that the revolution's story took a different and darker turn. Now let's look at paradox 2, which illustrates the same argument. It goes like this. The sexual revolution was supposed to liberate women, yet simultaneously it has become harder than before to have what most women still say they want, marriage and a family. That's not a tendentious way of phrasing the point. Women from across the political spectrum agree that marrying and mating for life has become more difficult than it used to be. That's one reason why biological experiments like commercial surrogacy and egg freezing are now being conducted. In the case of egg freezing, with the enthusiastic endorsement of the corporate world. The idea behind these innovations is to extend the horizon of natural fertility so that women are freer to stay in the workplace and can take longer to find a husband and raise a family. The idea, like the idea behind widespread contraception and abortion on demand, is to empower women and put them in control. Yet here again, paradoxically, many women seem to find themselves less able than ever to get married, stay married, and have a family. Just consider the way this preoccupation echoes across media and social media. Here are some recent headlines. From the New York Post, 8 reasons why New York women can't find a husband. Number 2, by the way, is always looking at your iPhone. Daily Beast, why college-educated women can't find love. And there are many like-minded headlines, again, from across the political spectrum, illustrating the conundrum here. Well, as it turns out, economists have explained the reality behind these apprehensions, too. They are more unanticipated fallout from the revolution. Sociologist Mark Regnerus has explained this very clearly in his new book, Cheap Sex, Men, Marriage, and Monogamy, which uses the tools of economics to explain the post-revolutionary sexual market, aided by a formidable supply of new data that he uses to make his case. So I will spare you the data sets and regression analyses and just go straight to the point. Regnerus distills the essence of his argument as follows. To plenty of women, it appears that men have a fear of commitment, but men on average are not afraid of commitment. The story is that men are in the driver's seat in the marriage market and are optimally positioned to navigate it in a way that privileges their interests and preferences, unquote. In other words, the same force that eroded the shotgun wedding has gone on to empower men, not women. One of the economists cited by Regnerus is Timothy Ryker, who wrote a lengthy and like-minded economic analysis of the revolution in a 2010 essay for First Things. I recommend this essay especially for the economists among you. Mr. Ryker argued, using data from the 1960s onward, that, quote, the revolution has resulted in a massive redistribution of wealth and power from women and children to men, unquote. That is a striking formulation. More technically, he points out, contraception set up what economists call a prisoner's dilemma game, in which each woman is induced to make decisions rationally that ultimately make her and all women worse off, unquote. So let's step back from the argument for a moment. Obviously, we are not speaking here of the deliberately countercultural clubs and communities and universities, including this one, that have banded together as a counterculture since the 60s, precisely because they want an alternative to the dominant revolution-embracing culture. But if we keep our focus on the other side, the going cultural narrative in non-religious precincts, the kinds of places where the revolution isn't regarded as problematic, this is what we find. In that world, which is now the cultural mainstream, the fact that a lot of men aren't settling down, marrying, and having families is a constant preoccupation. It's why the phrase Peter Pan syndrome was coined in the 1980s. It's why the phrase failure to launch is common shorthand today. And it's why manolescent, for those who haven't heard that one, became a noun in Urban Dictionary. So all of these culturally common phenomena, according to the economists, have the same origin, which is diminished incentives for men to marry due to the flooded sexual marketplace. This outcome, too, is not one that people who cheered on the revolution in the 60s could possibly have foreseen, and it also can't be an outcome that many of them would have wanted. A third paradox has become the dominant social media soap opera of the day, and it goes like this. The revolution was supposed to empower women, so why do we have the secular sex scandals of 2017, etc., and the Me Too movement? In addition to the fact that marriage for many women has become a harder reach, there's also another paradoxical fallout of the revolution, and that's the fact that in retrospect, it licensed sexual predation on a scale not seen outside of conquering armies. Let's start with the emblematic example of Hugh Hefner, founder of Playboy, who died last year. His vast empire was made, of course, on pornographic photos of a great many women. He made himself an exemplar of his own philosophy, the Playboy philosophy of sophisticated drinks and music and, of course, easy sex. It was a commercial idea that caught on quickly. And it seems safe to guess that most people, when Playboy started, had no idea what would later emerge from accounts within the Playboy mansion about the sordid truth behind the advertising. Nevertheless, when Hefner died, many progressives, including many stealth-styled feminists, glowed with praise for this apostle of the revolution. Why? Because he cloaked his predatory designs in the language of sexual progressivism. As a piece in Forbes summarized the record, Playboy published its first article supporting the legalization of abortion in 1965, which is well before most other venues were signaling support. That was 8 years before the Roe v. Wade decision, and even before the feminist movement had latched onto the cause. It also published the phone numbers of hotlines that women could call and get safe abortions, unquote. My point is that Hefner's support of these causes appears inextricably tied up with his desire to live in a way that exploited women. And that same theme is the unwritten common denominator that joins together many of today's secular sex scandals. The Weinstein, etc. scandals revealed the same strategic role occupied by abortion for many other men who want to objectify women and who disdain monogamy. After all, without the backup of abortion, where would these men be? They would be in court paying child support. Now, in this case, too, more and more thinkers outside the religious sphere have come to conclude the same thing. The revolution did not deliver on its promises to women. Instead, it further enabled men, especially men without the best of intentions. Consider this quotation from non-religious social scientist Francis Fukuyama, author of The End of History. This comes from his 1999 book, The Great Disruption, which is about the 60s. He said, quote, "One of the greatest frauds perpetrated during the Great Disruption was the notion that the sexual revolution was gender neutral, benefiting women and men equally. In fact, the revolution served the interests of men and, in the end, put sharp limits on the gains that women might otherwise have expected from their liberation from traditional roles," unquote. That's almost 20 years ago. And with that observation, Mr. Fukuyama joins a long and growing list of non-religious thinkers who can now see more clearly in retrospect what some religious leaders have been saying all along. Again, the revolution effectively democratized sexual predation. No longer did one have to be a king or a master of the universe to sexually abuse or harass women in unrelenting serial fashion. All one needed was a world in which many women would be assumed to use contraception and in which many would also be further deprived of male protectors. In other words, all one needed was the world delivered by the revolution. A fourth paradox that has barely been studied at all, at least not systematically, needs to be, and that is the effect of the revolution on Christianity itself. To look back over the decades is to understand that the revolution is simultaneously polarizing the churches within and creating tighter ties among different denominations than ever before. For a long time after the 60s, commentators have argued about what the 60s meant for the churches. Some welcomed the innovations of Vatican II, for example, and the radical theological transformations of mainline Protestantism. Others deplored these changes. But wherever they have stood, observers of Christianity today have come to find one central fact unavoidable. The revolution is the single most divisive issue now afflicting the faith itself. And this is recognized by Protestants and Catholics on both sides of the divide. In 2004, for example, a book called A Church at War by Stephen Bates about the Anglican Communion summarized the argument on its back cover: will the politics of sex tear Anglicans and Episcopalians apart? I think we know the answer to that one. A few years later, writing of the same subject in a book called Mortal Follies, Episcopalians and the Crisis of Mainline Christianity, author William Murchison concluded his argument with this observation: for Episcopalians, as for large numbers of other Christians, the paramount issues today are sex and sexual expression, neither viewed by the culture as a means to an end, but as the end, unquote. In his 2015 book, Onward, Russell Moore reflected on the tensions between evangelical progressives and traditionalists like this, quote, when it comes to religion in America at the moment, progress always boils down to sex, unquote. And there are many more quotes that I could give you making the point that this truth is now widely recognized. So, once more, as in our other examples, it seems safe to say that the divisiveness out there today in the churches wasn't anything that most Christians of the 1960s wanted to embrace. The point is that those voices within the churches decades ago who just wanted Christianity to loosen up didn't know what they were starting, which is today's figurative civil war across denominations within the faith itself. A fifth, and for now final, paradox. The revolution didn't stop at sex. What many people thought would be a private transformation of relations between individuals has gone on to radically reconfigure not only family life, but life, period. Perhaps the least understood of the revolution's effects are these, what might be called the macrocosmic consequences, the way in which it continues to affect not only individuals, but society and politics both. Some of these changes are demographic. Across much of the world, families are smaller and more splintered from within than ever before in history. Some effects are political. Smaller and more fractured families have put unprecedented pressure on the welfare states of the Western world by reducing the tax bases required to sustain them. There are also social effects, and some of these are only beginning to be mapped, like the sharp rise in people living alone, or in people who report greatly reduced human contact, or other measures that make up the burgeoning field of what's called loneliness studies. And then there's the spiritual fallout, which also couldn't have been foreseen in the 60s. I have argued elsewhere that the revolution has given rise to a new secularist, quasi-religious faith, the most potent such body of beliefs since Marxism-Leninism. According to this new faith, pleasure is the highest good, and there is no clear moral standard beyond consent for anything that adults wish to do with one another. Whether they are conscious of it or not, many people in what is now the mainstream culture of our world treat the sexual revolution as religious bedrock, off limits for revision, no matter what consequences it has. All of these are just some examples of the new world that needs mapping out there and that will come to absorb intellectual attention for what we should hope is a long time to come. And there's grounds for optimism. It's taken over 50 years, after all, for opinion, including non-religious opinion, to realign about just some of the revolution's negative legacy. It may take 50 more or 100 for a full and honest empirical and intellectual accounting. Revisionist thinking about the revolution's effect in the world, however, has only just begun. In closing, one parting thought. The great Russian writer Leo Tolstoy was once sent by a journal to report about what happened in a local slaughterhouse. What he saw there moved him deeply. His subsequent description included an immortal line that I think applies widely, including to us here today. After relaying the facts of the matter, Tolstoy observed with devastating simplicity, "We cannot pretend we don't know these things." And that, I think, is exactly where humanity is in 2018 with respect to the sexual revolution. We can no longer pretend we don't know these things. Back in the 1960s, people could plead ignorance, including in good faith, about the fallout to come. Many had no idea how many millions of children would subsequently grow up without fathers, or how many more millions would be aborted, or just how much people from fractured homes might suffer in diverse ways, including turning to drugs and other self-destructive behaviors. Many people back then hoped that the revolution would not incur collateral damage. And in fairness, who could have foreseen the library of social science that would be built over the next 50 years, documenting just some of the human damage out there? Some people 50 years ago even hoped that the new freedoms and technological controls would have a stabilizing effect on marriage itself. As everyone knows, the 1968 papal encyclical Humanae Vitae, which also reaches its 50th anniversary this year, went on to become widely despised across the decades, precisely for arguing otherwise, for saying that the revolution would hurt romance and family and end up licensing predatory men and malignant governments. In many places, it's still reviled for those reasons. A great many people, including within the Catholic Church, have ferociously resisted Humanae Vitae's rejection of the revolution, including in some pretty high places. But again, in 2018, can we still, in good faith, pretend we don't know these things? In 1953, when the first issue of Playboy arrived on newsstands, many people might have wanted to believe its market hype about enhancing the sophistication and urbanity and grooming of American men. But by 2018, we can't pretend that this mainstreaming of pornography has been anything but a disaster for romance and a prime mover of today's divorces and other breakups. Similarly, in 1973, even supporters of Roe v. Wade could not have imagined the evidence to come. Some 58 million never-born micro-humans in the United States, gendercide, or the selective killing of girls for being girls, in various countries around the world, also numbering in the millions. Nor could supporters back then have imagined the technological leap that would unveil the truth about abortion once and for all, the sonogram machine. Can today's advocates for Roe claim the same unknowing that they could? To face facts squarely and to use them to tell a truthful story is not to deliver a Jeremiad, it is to empower. Going back to the example of Tolstoy, his observation about not pretending wasn't just some pretty literary turn. It's a banner to carry through life. To reject living under the falsehoods told by others about the revolution, even if they are now the dominant narrative of the age, is to embrace the freedom to write a new narrative, and a truer one. Only one step is needed toward revising the revolution's legacy in the direction of truth, ceasing to pretend that we don't know the record when every single year reveals it more and more. Thank you.
Thank you. Mrs. Eberstadt has graciously agreed to sign copies of her book, Adam and Eve After the Pill, Paradoxes of the Sexual Revolution, immediately following the lecture outside of Phillips Auditorium. We now have time for a few questions. Please raise your hand and wait for a microphone to be brought to you.
Ms. Eberstadt, thank you so much for coming out and speaking to us today. So in 2015, the United States Supreme Court heard the case of Obergefell versus Hodges, in which Justice Samuel Alito asked then Solicitor General Donald Verrilli what is going to be the impact of this decision on private colleges and universities that refuse to recognize same-sex marriage in the same sense that, for instance, Bob Jones refused to recognize interracial marriages. And Verrilli responded, this is going to be an issue. So my question to you is, do you agree with Verrilli? Is this going to be an issue for colleges moving forward? If so, and if not, and if you could talk to us a little bit about what the role of law is going to be here moving forward after that decision. Thank you so much.
First, let me say I'm not a lawyer, so I'm not qualified to speak to the law, but I'm glad you brought up Justice Alito. I think in his opinions, he has seen most clearly that what we're talking about here when we talk about secularism and religion is actually two rival faiths. And he saw that very clearly, and he saw that if the state enshrined one, which it has for some intents and purposes, the other would suffer, which it is. I think we're all pretty aware of that. Calling attention to this struggle as a struggle between religious faiths, I think, is more true to the facts than saying that it's about secularism versus religious belief. People are wired to believe something. The question is always what. So I think just for starters, we have to keep breaking the ground of making the other side understand that what they're talking about is their own set of religious beliefs and that the state has to be even-handed between those things.
Yes, ma'am. You mentioned the effect of the revolution on Christianity. What about on Muslim aspect?
That's a great question, and it's not something that I feel qualified to talk about. But about Christianity, I think it's very interesting that in the case of Protestantism as well as Catholicism, what's ended up happening is a Christian explosion across Africa. And in this explosion, more and more, because of the civil war within the Western churches, people are looking to leadership from a more tradition-minded Africa. The issues that consume us, these so-called social issues, are not the issues that consume African Christians for the most part. And I think one of the reasons for optimism is that we can expect leadership from that quarter, and it will be unafraid leadership that won't be pulled into the secularist mainstream that we have.
Thank you for speaking, Ms. Eberstadt. You've spoken a great deal about the negative effects of the sexual revolution here in the United States and touched briefly on international demographics in the post-revolution world. Could you further elaborate on the extent to which, in your view, American culture has exported these negative effects to foreign countries, and give us any ideas you have that could help us begin reversing that process?
Well, that's easy. I think just as we look back on the 60s and say, wow, that looks weird now. This looks weird, this looks weird, this looks weird. I think in 50 years, one of the things that's going to look really weird in the rearview mirror is that you have people like Melinda Gates and the Gates Foundation proselytizing for contraception all over places with poorer, darker people. It's a very peculiar thing, and it sends a really, I think, arrogant message, which used to be known as the ugly American, the American who goes around the world and stomps around trying to impose his views on everybody else. This is a particularly, I think, noxious area where the view of America that people have in places like India, Africa, others one could name, is partly the view of white people coming in and saying, the solution to our problems is there should be fewer of you. I don't mean this is what the people who do this kind of proselytizing have in mind. I certainly don't think they're conscious of it. But that is what it looks like very often on the receiving end. And I think just having a little more humility about our non-governmental organizations and the negative image that they send of the United States. I think that would be a good thing for starters, and just raising consciousness about it seems to be the way to go.
Thank you so much for your talk. You mentioned that the Catholic Church has headed up a lot of the attack against the sexual revolution, the pushback with Humana Vitae and Pope John Paul II's theology of the body. And there's been a lot of division among other denominations about what to do about this. What do you think the role of the evangelical church should be, and what should they do to try to get behind the effort to push back against the sexual revolution?
Look, I have enough trouble trying to tell the Catholic Church what to do. But, you know, it's really interesting. I think within both traditions, there's a certain diehard contingent that comes straight out of the 60s that is not reproducing itself literally or figuratively. That is to say, when you look at who leads the charge on backing away from traditional teaching these days, it's not the younger people. I mean, the younger people are coming into the churches, Protestant and Catholic alike, because they're looking for orthodoxy. They're looking for something real, you know? I mean, that is the signal thing about the millennials that everybody agrees on, that they're looking for something authentic. So those people are on the traditionalist side of the equation, and over time, I think it's going to make some of this furor just go away. One book I would mention in this regard is there's a demographer named Eric Kaufman who wrote a book some of you may have heard of. It's called Shall the Religious Inherit the Earth? And he makes the point, he's perfectly secular, but he shows that over time you can expect that religion will not only not go away, but that the heterodox elements of it will eventually peel off. And the reason is that the more religious people are, the more they have families of size. He calls this the iron rule of demography. And over time, the younger, more faithful, more orthodox elements, you know, sort of, I wouldn't say put granny on the iceberg, but, you know, they tend to have, they tend to become more and more the flavor of the church.
So this summer in New York City, I met a lot of young Christian women who were single and looking for love, and I'm wondering, are there ways they went to church, and like I just met up with them in groups, and they said, you know, we have these problems that there are just people, and there's not a lot of men like who seem to be interested in us. So I'm wondering, are there ways to level the playing field, I guess, somehow in dating between men and women? Or is that not a problem, do you think, of sexual? I mean, I guess I'm interested in what you have to say.
Well, remember the New York Post says stop looking at your iPhone, for starters. But in a way, no, because we're up against biology. I mean, that's the whole point of freezing eggs, right, is that most men are fertile until forever. And women are not without a great deal of artificial interference. So that's what egg freezing is for. If that's where we have to go to level the playing field, then, I mean, my guess would be we need to look at the playing field differently or build a new one, which is what I see in these, you know, in countercultural communities all the time, who are not playing by these rules, who are not on Tinder, who are not, you know, shopping for people that way. And I think there's a lot to be said that's optimistic like that, because the 1960s not only gave rise to the counterculture of its time, it also has given rise to a very opposite counterculture that we see in places like this, that we see in a lot of campus groups, including on secular campuses. And all of that is grounds for hope. So again, no Jeremiah.
But do you think like some of that comes from the church, or like so that should happen in the church? Or I guess are there ways that the church can help with that? Because I think these were young Christian women, and they just like weren't having any
are like there was just no men who are stepping up. And do you think that's pervaded the church? That there's like no dating happening? And I don't know. I don't think it was just for like one church group that I went to. It was several church groups that I went to over New York, and it just seemed to be kind of a common problem. So I'm wondering, like, how can the church help with that, or like what?
Yeah, no, I mean, clearly some of what's going on here is that people are using Tinder and other kinds of, things on their phone to meet people because the churches are not doing what historically they did. And that's not to dump on the churches, but I mean, in Washington, D.C., where I'm from, I can think of a number of venues for young adults that are specifically, designed for this. That is not in a creepy way of like, en masse matchmaking, but just to bring people together who have shared ideas and who don't want to be meeting in bars and on Tinder. So yeah, I'm sure there's a lot more the churches could all do in this regard.
Hi, I'm over here. My question is, with today's media presence that kind of jumps at the slightest word against this empirical evidence as to kind of the true reasons for the decline in our culture, in what ways can we gently educate the populace as to the actual empirical evidence behind these kind of downward spirals, maybe in a less controversial way, say, than like a Ben Shapiro figure?
Oh, yeah, I think there's plenty of it. I mean, what I try to do, in part, is look at evidence that's not coming from religious precincts, because I think that's very powerful evidence. I'll give you an example. Some of you, those of you who listen to Eminem, probably know that he has a new song sung by Ed Sheeran called The River. And it's a very moving, upsetting song. It came out last month. It is a man expressing his fury and his remorse over an abortion. That is perfectly secular evidence that the idea that arose from the 1960s that's enshrined in Roe v. Wade, the blob of tissues idea, is just untenable. I mean, if someone like rap's biggest superstar can see that and put that out there, that's proof that the ground has really shifted. I think we should look for openings like that. I think we should make, common cause with feminists when the occasion suits. I'll give you an example. There's, I think, fully one member of the board of NOW who is against commercial surrogacy because she thinks it exploits women. So, when the churches resonate with natural law and come up with these rules for humanity, we have to have faith that that's not arbitrary. That's like resonating with something about human nature that other people can see, including people who are not churched. And I think the final proof of this is the fact that on the social issues, support for abortion has been dropping among younger people ever since, say, the invention of the sonogram. So there we have another case where, people just don't want to go there just because of the evidence that they've seen. And I think, we should work with all of that. I think there's a big coalition out there waiting to happen on abortion, on the life issues, that might swing the pendulum the other way on some other stuff.
Thank you, Mrs. Eberstadt, for coming to speak here at Hillsdale. One cultural trend that I noticed that resulted from the sexual revolution is the loosening of standard for modesty and dress, especially for women. And so you said one of the step that we need to take is to acknowledge that the sort of truth behind what has resulted from the sexual revolution. And so would you think that churches acknowledging the problem of dress and modesty, do you think that could be a good step in trying to undo the damage of the sexual revolution?
Yeah, I think that's a great point. I mean, that is something that gets soft-pedaled. And it's also something that everybody who's the parent of a daughter is aware of. And again, I mean, I think there could be quite a lot to work with there, yeah. But part of what we're up against here is that a lot of women have been told, have imbibed the lie that, they're kind of interchangeable units with men. They're not, and so to establish standards for modesty, it has to be explained the ways in which the sexes differ. But yeah, I'm sure there's a lot of education that could be done that way. Thank you. Great point.
You've spoken a lot about how this issue affects females, and certainly it's a very female-centric issue. But my question is, in the secular world, there's very much the claim that men should not speak about topics such as this, and they have no business kind of interfering in abortion and in birth control pills. So my question is, to what degree is it the responsibility of one or both sexes to reverse this trend, and how can men kind of get their foot in on the secular field in addressing these issues when they're largely told they shouldn't speak about them?
Well, I mean, a little spine. I don't mean that demeaningly. I mean to say, like, we have to be careful ourselves that we don't absorb lies of the kind that I was describing in the speech. And one of those lies is the idea that you're not privileged to speak about X, Y, or Z unless you line up A, B, or C on the identity calculus. I mean, if anything, I think trying to appeal to other people's reason and giving them the dignity of being considered full conversational partners is something that's a very good example to the other side, because the other side doesn't usually do it. So I would say if there are men hanging back from this discussion because they feel like they don't have standing to have an opinion, then they've bought into a kind of false consciousness that they need to leave behind somewhere.
You've spoken some about how damaging apps such as Tinder can be to the modern dating culture. And I'm just curious, like, do you think that religious dating apps such as Christian Mingle and JSwipe are in ways similarly exploitive and damaging to the formation and foundation of relationships? Like, is the internet culture of instant gratification in dating still damaging even when it's not secular?
I think getting in the habit of shopping for human beings the way you would shop on Amazon has got to take its toll. That's not to say there aren't worse ways of doing it or better ways of doing it, but fundamentally, and I would appeal here to Mark Regnerus's book, which I urge anybody interested in this stuff to read, Cheap Sex, which just came out. It has a sensational title, but the numbers are anything but sensational. And he is particularly concerned with Tinder and related apps. He actually makes the argument that the three big technological leaps have been the birth control pill, the invention of really high-quality internet pornography, and third, he puts this on the same level, devices that are, apps that allow you to shop for people. And one thing he's able to show is that the more these are used, the less likely it is that any one of them sticks, because there's always the thought, well, if this one doesn't work out tomorrow morning, I can just, go back to that.
So I was here all day yesterday, went home, and arose this morning to discover that the Senate yesterday failed to pass legislation which would have prohibited abortions after 20 weeks. Very disappointing to read that. Apparently there were actually 2 Republican senators who voted to not go along with the legislation, and of course I believe all the Democrats did. It had already been passed in the Congress side and the House side and failed in the Senate. So my question for you is, do you think that in some ways this matter of abortion has really become more of a dog whistle issue for a lot of Republicans who are in fact, they actually don't want it to be changed because they know they can continue to blow this whistle and to bring conservatives to vote for them, but when the rubber meets the road, they're actually unwilling to do the right thing in this matter. I was at the March for Life a couple of weekends ago, and President Trump said a few things that indicated that if legislation were passed, that he would actually sign it. And it seems we've got a Republican House, we have a Republican Senate, we have a Republican president. If this is ever going to happen, it seems like now is the time for it to happen. Otherwise, really the Republicans are just cowards on this matter, and they're using it to manipulate conservatives Would you agree with that? What is your opinion on that?
I can't speak to the state of their souls. I don't know how many people on the Republican side are cynics or opportunists about this. But I would point to a couple of reasons for optimism. One is the fact that the decline in support for abortion among younger voters especially is something that is going to have to be reckoned with. It may not be this year, it may not be 10 years from now, but it shows no sign of declining. And it's something that politicians will have to take into account. As a subsidiary point, it was noted after the election that it was said by some Democrats and progressives, maybe we've been too absolutist about abortion. Maybe that's where, we could do a little compromising and get a pro-life voice back in our party again. Now, so far, not much has come of that, but I think the fact that that thought emanated upwards and from various people suggests that eventually the Democratic Party is going to have to relinquish its current absolutism on this. And the other reason for optimism is that I was also at that March for Life, and it's unmistakable. The face of that movement is a young face, and the other side has nothing to match it. Again, because neither literally nor morally do they reproduce themselves in this way. There are plenty of young women, including young celebrities, who they put up, but they don't have anything like that show of force that's on the mall. And sooner or later, the fact that, whatever you think about abortion, you have to acknowledge that we've got the most extreme such regimen in the world almost. That, too, is going to have to be reckoned with, and I think by both parties. So disappointing though that particular outcome was, I think keep trying is probably the best thing to say about it.
We have time for one more question.
Well, one of my questions is the impact on children. First of all, you talked about things that we can see. At one point, parents prided themselves in the number of children they could have. Today, we seem to think small families are the norm. And also, it's the impact on the fatherless homes. The number of children that are living in split homes. These are things that anyone can see in our society. What Western civilization is not reproducing itself.
There are two kinds of evidence here: the evidence of one's senses, right, and what one can see, including in one's own surroundings. And then there's also what I only referred to glancingly, just because it's too large to get into, the entire library of social science establishing all the various connections between the fractured family and bad outcomes for kids. Bad outcomes defined as things that I think most of us are familiar with: lower educational achievement, higher criminality, et cetera. And of course, it upsets people to hear about this because something like almost half of all kids in America are now going to grow up without their biological father in the home. So that's a lot of, collateral damage. But we need to recognize it as collateral damage. And again, as with other elements of this general argument, I would look for friends in unexpected places. I've had occasion to write elsewhere about popular music. As jarring as it sounds to people who grew up with the Beach Boys, there's a lot to work with in the music out there, because a lot of it is reflecting all of these themes of, what it's like to come from a tumultuous home, what it's like not to know your father, et cetera. And this is especially dominant in rap music, interestingly enough. So I would just try to build bridges wherever we can to the understanding that the way many people are living now is unnatural, not their fault, but unnatural nonetheless, and that there's a better place where we can get this country. Thank you. Thank you.